Welcome, folks. We'll just give people a moment to get into the webinar and then we'll get started. People are trickling in. Just going to give it another moment. Welcome, everybody. Well, thanks so much for joining us this evening. We do hope to keep you all awake with this important presentation and the discussion to follow. We'll try to keep that as lively as possible. I'm Joyce Kennedy with People and Pollinators Action Network, and I'm so pleased to be joined by our partners, Binta Dixon of the American Bird Conservancy, and Lena Frage and Dan Rochelle of the Natural Resources Defense Council. So in acronym speak, we have PPAN, ABC, and NRDC here. PPAN advocates for pollinator protection and conservation through education and actions that promote sustainable land management to safeguard humid and pollinator health. And one aspect of our work is to advocate for policies that reduce the use of neonics. We worked on a pollinator health bill at the state legislature in 2022 to restrict neonic use and ban its use on turf and ornamental plants. This bill also included an incentive for agricultural producers to trial seeds that hadn't been treated with neonics. Now, unfortunately, that bill did not pass, and it is very difficult to pass pesticide-related bills and can take multiple tries. But you will also learn about a new exciting program that will incentivize farmers this evening. In 2023, a bill was passed to limit the use of neonics. This law says that only licensed dealers can sell neonics, and while it's a good first step, it's not that difficult to get licensed. So we look forward to future policies that can further reduce neonic use in Colorado. So tonight you'll learn more about neonics, why they're an issue for birds, other wildlife, and human health, and actions you can take as well. And just a few housekeeping measures. If you can please keep your microphones muted during the presentation, and you can use the chat box for questions if you have them as the presentations are being made. And this will be recorded, so it will be available afterward. And now to get us started, I'd like to welcome Binta Dixon from the American Bird Conservancy.
Thank you so much, Joyce Kennedy, for that introduction and for your partnership. I'm just going to slide for a second. All right, so thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Binta Dixon, and I wanted to actually start with a question for you all. I'd love to know, what birds have you been seeing recently? Feel free to share in the chat. I know for me, my sister-in-law, I say Blue Jay from Lenore, thank you. My sister-in-law lives near a urban national park in Colorado. And so seeing the osprey is like one of my favorite things there. It's such a beautiful sight. The turkey vultures, Katrina, flicker, crows, magpie, towhee, chickadees, yes, love those as well. House finch, wonderful. Yes, magpies in Lakewood, Colorado, red-breasted nuthatch. Those are all wonderful sights. And thank you all for sharing that. Just a little bit about American Bird Conservancy, we are an organization dedicated to our bird population, and we do this through field work, policy and advocacy, working on programs around threats to birds, outreach and awareness, as well as an international reserve network. And so I also have another question for you all if you'd like to participate, which is, why are birds important to you? They're calming to watch. Yes, I agree with that. They are for me as well. They're beautiful. They're excellent pollinators, the circle of life, bird songs, joy, all of these. I wholeheartedly agree with all of these because they are sentient beings with their own goals. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, throughout history, birds, we've looked up to them, right? Both literally and metaphorically. They inspire us with their calls, with their colors. So many things about birds connect us to our family, to the places that we live. And also, in addition to that, they are wonderful and important key measurers of the health of our ecosystems. So birds help to tell us not only are our ecosystem doing well, but if they're thriving, including the water and wildlife. Birds also are such important pollinators, like somebody said, and they spread enough seeds to help keep forests alive, which is such a key aspect for our environment. However, we know that birds are being drastically impacted right now. We have the research that tells us that we're losing birds at an alarming rate. Birds like the Gunson sage grouse and the red-bellied woodpecker are at great risk in Colorado. One of the dangers to birds that we're really keenly aware of is pesticides. And I like to take a breath when I read this number because I feel like seeing this is sometimes difficult to process, but it is something that we have to reckon with. 100 million every year through pesticide use. And today we're going to focus on a specific kind of pesticide, and that is neonicotinoids, also known as neonics. They are a group of insecticides that are widely used on farms and in urban landscapes. And because these neonics are water soluble and so widely used, they're found in water sources and soil all over the country, making them a danger and a threat to birds nationwide. The prolific use of neonics kills birds not only through direct contact, but through indirect impacts, such as killing the food supply and making non-target insects poisonous to them. And as you can see through this chart, this illustration, it doesn't just stop with one seed or with one spray. It has far-reaching implications. And these are some of the most common ways that pesticides are impacting birds that we see. And to talk a little bit more about the harm, we know that it not only reduces their appetite, it causes confusion and death. Small birds and small bird species are most impacted by small dosages of exposure. So a bird can have this pesticide kind of accumulate in their blood. These three pesticides that you see here are very common, commonly used. And this accumulation happens in farm birds, but also birds in all habitats. That leads me to the ecosystem impacts. So beyond a single bird or a single bird species, we see that the habitats that birds inhabit or need to survive are being drastically impacted by the use of neonics. Sorry. And they also create resistance in crops. leading to more use of pesticides, which further impacts birds. I'd like to take a little time to talk about the specific crops in Colorado that are most affected by neonics and how this relates to birds. Now you can see here that a large percentage of potato plants are treated in Colorado. In 2022, we have this statistic, 53,000 acres. Also, the amount of corn planted in 2021, over 193 acres were treated with insecticides. This means that all the birds that frequent that cropland and that farmland have the potential to be killed by this pesticide. Barley is another important crop for Colorado. They're a top producer. They had over 54,000 acres in 2023. And we know that countrywide, barley, half of it is treated with insecticides. I want to just emphasize again that one neonic treated seed is enough to kill a small songbird. And as you can see here, to be able to spot a coated seed is usually pretty easy. This is an illustration of how it might look treated. So knowing all of this, what is it that we can do? Because we as individuals, as citizens, as groups, as collaborators, we can do something about this really devastating issue. I love that photo there of the prairie falcon. Steps to consider. First, we need more bird-specific research. ABC and many groups and many researchers are engaged in coming out with the most research we can to prove and to show folks how devastating neonics can be for birds. However, we need more of that. Common sense legislation, regulations on neonic use, and local action. Within Colorado, there are things that you can do locally to help support the birds there. And I'm going to leave it to my colleagues to talk more about that coming up. And I will leave you with this one, or I'll ask one last question. What is something that you are considering hearing this about birds? How is one way that you could potentially stand up for birds? And you can think about that or put it in the chat as we continue this presentation. And I will leave you with this quote. Wherever there are birds, there are hope. And as we stand up for birds, I truly believe that we can foster more hope and an actual solutions for this problem. Thank you. Again, my name is Benta Dixon. And if you are in the Western region and you'd like to reach out, talk more about this, collaborate, I would love to speak with you. You can reach me at my email address, which is here. And now I will hand it over to my NRDC colleagues to talk about more of the far-reaching impacts of neonics.
Thanks, Benta. So, okay, I'm going to try and share my screen here and start the slideshow. Oh. Okay.
You might, do you want to, there we go. Okay. I was gonna say it needs to go to the beginning, but you got it.
Yeah, a little bit of delay. Hi everyone. My name is Dan Rochelle. I direct the Pollinators and Pesticides work for the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. We're an international nonprofit that works to protect the earth, its inhabitants, and its environment. I'm joined by my colleague, Lena Frage, and we wanted to give a little bit more context on neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, why they're so problematic, not just for birds, but for ecosystems at large, really why they may be some of the most ecologically destructive pesticides we've seen since DDT, their threats to our own health, and also what folks have been doing about neonic pollution around the world, around the country, and what folks in Colorado might be able to do as well. So first, just to concentrate a little bit on neonics, what are they? So neonics are neurotoxic insecticides, which means they are pesticides designed to kill bugs by attacking their nerves. And they do so by permanently attaching to those nerves and overstimulating them, causing the nerves to fire until they eventually die. So if you have seen a bee, for example, that has been acutely poisoned with neonics, oftentimes that bee will start to twitch uncontrollably before becoming paralyzed and dying. But, you know, a lot of pesticides kill insects in gruesome ways. Why are we so concerned about neonics in particular? And there are three big reasons. So the first is that neonics are just super duper toxic to bees and other insects. And those neonic-coated seeds that Binta showed you earlier, just one corn seed that she mentioned has enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird, also has enough active ingredient to kill about 250,000 bees, just that thin coating on one corn seed. And in fact, neonics have made U.S. agriculture about 48 times more harmful to insect life since their introduction. If you look at where that harmfulness really begins to crop up, it's almost exactly at the same time that beekeepers across the country, Colorado included, start to see their annual losses of honeybee colonies just shoot through the roof, right? Going from about 10, 15% a year, mostly due to winter cold, something to 30, 40, 50% a year, and happening year round, happening in the summer too. And as you can see, you follow this red line here on the chart, those annual losses are about as high as they've ever been, right? This problem has not gone away. Now, what's happened is, in response, the honeybee industry, honeybees are essentially livestock, has responded by continually rebreeding honeybee colonies. So we've been able to maintain colony levels by furiously rebreeding bee colonies. The whole system is sort of held together with duct tape. But the problem is the same is not happening with our wild bees. And we know that the honeybees are canaries in the coal mine for what's happening in our natural environment. There are over 900 species of wild bees in Colorado alone. And that's concerning for ecosystems because bees and other pollinators are keystone species for ecosystems. They're required for plants to breed and reproduce. It's also a problem for crop pollination. Honeybee colonies are about as weak as they've ever been. And we're realizing that wild bees are actually excellent pollinators on the farm. So the fact that we have fewer wild bees and our honeybee colonies are weaker has resulted in a number of top crops across the country, apples, blueberries, and cherries, being pollinator limited. Second problem with neonics is that they are very good at contaminating entire ecosystems. So they're designed to permeate plants. That was their major innovation when they came on the scene. What they do is they get into the leaves, the roots, the pollen, the nectar, everything. They make the plant itself toxic to insects. The plant itself becomes the pesticide. And that means that neonics can be applied in all sorts of interesting ways. Of course, they can be sprayed, and they are commonly, but more commonly, they're applied to the soil or, as Binta showed you, literally painted on crop seeds. And here's a picture of some neonic-treated corn seed. Here's a close-up. As you can see, they pick all sorts of different colors for the pesticides. They don't always pick the same color. I think Binta's seeds were blue. They sort of look like toxic Skittles. And the idea is, as that seed is growing into a plant, it literally soaks up that pesticide coating through its roots and becomes toxic. The problem is only 2 to 5% make it into the target plant. The other 95+% stays in the soil where it persists for years and years and years. And those same properties that let it get up into the plant so easily, namely they're really water soluble, right? They dissolve readily in water, means that anytime there's rain, anytime there's irrigation, lawn watering, if this is a lawn application, Those neonics are moving through the soil. They're moving to new soil. If that new soil has roots from wild plants, those wild plants soak up the pesticides, they become toxic. Their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water supply nearby, you better believe that water supply is becoming polluted. The problem with neonics is they are just all over the place. So a lot of people think agriculture, and certainly that's their largest use by far, particularly on coated crop seeds, but they're also all over lawns, gardens, golf courses, pet products, bedbug products, you name it. They are just about everywhere. And to give you a sense of scale, here's a map of the use of just one neonic chemical. There's 5 major neonic chemicals approved. So this is just 1 out of 5, and it is just agricultural uses. I know 2014 is not super recent, but it's the most recent year that we have seed data for, and that's where sort of 90% of the use is. And you can see in Colorado, this is pretty heavily filled in sort of the corn and producing region of the state. But again, this is a very incomplete picture. It doesn't have the 2 other major seed treatment chemicals. It doesn't have the non-agricultural uses, lawns, gardens, golf courses. So the area around Denver would be much more filled in. Colorado Springs would be much more filled in if we were looking at those lawn and garden uses. And actually in those areas, neonics are approved at much higher rates per acre. So we actually see these toxic hotspots of water contamination in those urban and suburban areas. But what this does give you a sense is that neonics are used all over the place. They're used in the same places year after year after year. So what you get is a buildup of toxicity in the environment every year that is constantly expanding every time it rains to contaminate every nook and cranny of the environment, getting into soil, getting into water, getting into wildlife, etc. And so what's the sum total impact of that? I should note, we see this contamination in Colorado, right? We see it in the federal surface water testing, which shows neonics in surface waters across the state. Roughly about a quarter of samples in recent years are testing positive for imidacloprid. But what's funny is most of these tests are not testing for the other 4 chemicals. For some reason, everybody loves imidacloprid. But we know that some of these other chemicals are often used more, especially in ag settings. So this is probably a small picture, but still we're seeing it in a quarter of samples, and most of those are above levels, EPA levels for harms to aquatic ecosystems. So already a problem, but probably much bigger than what we're seeing. And we're also seeing a lot of groundwater contamination in Weld County, which is one of the corn producing areas. But the sensitivity of those tests is not great, right? So the levels that we're seeing are very high. So if the sensitivity of those tests were greater, I'm sure we would see much more contamination, both in Weld County groundwater and across the state, particularly those corn producing areas. So what's the total impact of this contamination that we see in Colorado and across the country? Well, we know it is driving a lot of species into a bad place. And EPA found a little over a year ago that neonics were likely driving 200 plus endangered species toward extinction. This is a wacky large finding. I do not know of any jeopardy determination that is larger than this. If folks know the Endangered Species Act, it's a no-no to jeopardize even 1 endangered species. This is over 200. It just gives you a sense of the silent spring-like effects that these pesticides have. Neonics have been tied to sort of the insect apocalypse. For those who maybe remember in the early 80s driving around a rural area in summertime, oftentimes you'd have to turn on your windshield wipers to get all the bugs off. And we just don't see that across the country these days. We're losing our insect populations. And there's definitely links we know now between neonics and losses of all sorts of species. This study came out just this summer. And what was neat about this study is it looked at different factors: change, habitat loss, other stressors, other pesticides, and neonics were the #1 cause. In particular, their use as coatings on crop seeds in the loss of butterflies, particularly monarch butterflies. A few months later, we saw another study connecting neonic use to the loss of wild bees across the country. So we continue to get a drumbeat of study after study after study, and this is on heaps of studies over the years, continuing to point the finger at these pesticides as a major cause of insect loss. But it goes deeper than that, and for that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Lena.
Thanks, Dan. So yeah, so all of these losses, this contamination, all of this harm, it extends far beyond just our pollinators. Neonics are damaging for whole ecosystems, and they are a real driver for biodiversity loss. And one key study here that shows this is this study from Japan. And in the study, researchers looked at zooplankton. And for those of you who don't know what zooplankton look like, they may not be the cutest guys in the world, although I think they're kind of cute. But they're hugely important to aquatic food webs. They're basically water bugs. So with this study, they had a data set going back all the way to 1980, which is super rare, just for what it's worth. And they found that in the early 90s, in this otherwise sustainable fishery, the zooplankton and the fish that ate the zooplankton just completely died off. The fishery collapsed. And later the authors later connected those die-offs to the introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture. And we see really similar impacts in birds. I know Binta talked about this, but we see neonics linked to bird losses and bird biodiversity. We see it especially with insect-eating birds. And I'm sure folks here are familiar with this Cornell report. It came out a couple years ago, about 30% of bird losses over the last 50 years. And so after that study came out, a couple researchers looked at that data set and they separated the birds out, one by birds where insects are an essential part of their diet, and another where insects are not essential. And so if you look at where the birds where insects are not essential, they're doing all right? They're kind of hanging in there. But for the birds that rely on insects, they are really suffering very much. And sadly, that is most birds, right? That is the vast majority of birds that are insect eating. And so that's the indirect effects, right? So as for the direct effects, I'm going to say it for the third time, as we all have said tonight, neonics are also directly toxic to birds by consuming neonic-treated seed, right? Consuming just one neonic-treated seed can kill a small songbird. And when things start to get really scary is when we look at mammals. Several years ago, there were hunters in the Midwest that started noticing these really strange things happening with deer that they were hunting, just really surprising, unusual deformities you absolutely do not you don't experience this in nature. And so some researchers did some controlled studies. They exposed deer to real world levels of neonics in their water. And lo and behold, this controlled study found those exposures were related to deer being born with like deformed jaws, these really weird things going on with the organs, increased states of stillbirth. And even for adult deer, there were also effects. They were seeing neurological and hormonal issues. Now, of course, industry's response was, well, that's not indicative of real world experience. This is a controlled study. It doesn't reflect what deer are actually experiencing in nature. So the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources said, okay, then we'll get receipts. And they did. So they did a study where they had hunters across the state submit spleens of the deer that they caught. So that means like 800 spleens were just casually making their way through the mail. And they found not only that neonics are in deer, that they're in the spleens, but they are increasing by over 30%. So between 2019 and 2021, neonics went from being in around 61% of deer to 94% of deer in Minnesota. And it jumped from having 29 to 64% of those deer above levels associated with higher rates of birth defects and death. And this correlates pretty strongly with what we know, right? We know that neonics are everywhere. They persist for years. And so when you keep compounding those uses year after year after year in the same places, you're going to get this buildup of toxicity in the environment. It's going to expand every time there's rain or irrigation, and it's going to get everywhere, including the bodies of mammals. And that is a huge concern because deer are big mammals, and we are also very large mammals. Recent CDC research found that about half of the United States population is regularly exposed to neonics, and they know that through a biomonitoring study, and actually found neonics in people's urine, or the breakdown of those pesticides in people's urine. A recent study found neonics in over 95% of 171 pregnant women, with the highest levels in Hispanic women. And what was really scary about that study is that each year of the study, so over 4 years, the levels increased. So pregnant women were getting more and more exposed as the years progressed. And those exposure levels are concerning because studies suggest that neonics may increase the risk of developmental and neurological damage in humans. Even though a lot of that science, just being transparent, it's in its infancy now. I think we're really going to see more and more of this in the coming years. But similar to what we saw in deer, although of course in human studies, we can't do controlled studies for ethical reasons. So it's based on their population-based studies. But even those population-based human studies showed that neonic exposure is associated with very similar symptoms to those that deer experience. And of course, not everybody is going to have equal availability to avoid neonic exposures. In addition to the disproportionate effects that I talked about on Hispanic women, we can also see that there are clear inequities in the way that neonics indirectly harm low-income and food-challenged communities. As we all know, eating organic is an excellent way to reduce consumption of pesticides, but organic food is generally more expensive. It can be inaccessible for some communities. We also know that water filtration systems can also help, but those are also expensive. And with rising food costs due to pollinator losses, I think we're just going to see nutritious food become more expensive. And so that's obviously going to be hitting low-income communities of color, I think, the hardest. How is the world responding to this, right? The EU banned all outdoor use of neonics. Canada imposed significant restrictions. As for the United States, at least at the federal level, EPA has effectively done nothing. They've just permitted neonic use, even though, as Dan mentioned, they found that neonics are likely driving over 200 species towards extinction. They've basically just ignored a lot of evidence about their risk to human health and the environment. And I think that's largely because I think the pesticide office has been pretty captured by industry. They've just allowed business as usual. But, big but, a lot of states have made movement. There has been movement at the state level. New York and Vermont, for example, have taken action to reduce the use of neonic seed treatment, which we know is the bulk of neonic use and the vast majority of it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that New York bill in just a second. But other states have taken action on the lawn and garden uses, which, as Dan talked about, is really important. It's a lot of toxic hotspots and concentrated neonic exposures in these areas. So, and some other states have also made neonics restricted use, which is something we can discuss later. Not super effective, but a great first step. So to jump back to what New York did, this bill just passed last year, the NRDC, and especially Dan actually helped pass, no big deal, the Birds and the Bees Protection Act. It's pretty fantastic and an incredibly effective model, I think, for other states to follow. It's based on this Cornell report. It reviewed over 1,000 peer-reviewed studies and found two key things. It first found neonic coatings on corn, soybean, and wheat seeds provided no economic benefit to farmers on average. So there's just no yield. The cost of putting the pesticide on the seed to yield, not worth it for farmers. And secondly, they found that lawn and garden uses were likewise unnecessary. And there were also safer alternatives available. So the New York bill really focused on these two main findings in the Cornell report. And the way the program works is that in order to use neonics, farmers basically have to demonstrate a legitimate pest problem and get a waiver, sort of seeing it like a prescription, right? You want to use neonics, then demonstrate that you need them. And this program was modeled after a model in Quebec. So in Canada, they implemented this in 2019, and it reduced neonic use from 100% in corn to 50% in soybeans, from 100% in corn and 50% in soybeans down to virtually nothing. And so we know this model works, right? We know it's effective at reducing the vast bulk of neonic use. New York is doing it. Vermont is doing it. We know it's effective. So we're really hoping to see this happen in more places too. So now for the fun part, what can you do to get involved? So I know these links aren't clickable. Maybe I can drop them in the chat after this, but for folks who want to email your Colorado state representatives, you can definitely shoot them an email, but better yet, you can call your representatives. Please call them. Calling your state rep is so meaningful. Trust me, they keep track of this sort of stuff. I think this is really where you have the greatest impact. They care what you think. If you call them and you say you want action on neonics, they will notice. But also, if you know any other folks who might be interested in hearing about neonics or they want to take action, let us know. We're happy to connect with folks. I can give this presentation in my sleep. It's for free, so I'm happy to do it. Also, if you want to stay in touch about future actions in Colorado, there's another form. So if you want to stay in the loop, you can feel free to. And also for what you can do at home, you can plant native plants and don't use pesticides, especially neonics, and check those dog collars, cat collars, the pet products you're using. So many of them have neonics. I've had to ask our vet specifically not to use a not to give us any products with neonics in them. So I'm going to pass this back to Binta now, because I think there are also some actions that ABC would like to talk about.
Thank you, Lena and Dan. Yes, one thing I would love to talk about is a new program that American Bird Conservancy just launched, which is the Untreated Seed Pilot Program. And this pays farmers to use untreated seeds. So if you know someone in Colorado who is a farmer, large scale, small scale, medium scale, please let them know about this program. You can use the QR code there. And I will also put a link to the page in the chat as well. This is a program that I know many groups, including NRDC and PPAN, are really behind, and that many folks have supported this action. And it's just one of many that we can take to reduce the use of neonics in our environment and on birds and all wildlife and ourselves. So please take a look at that. We're excited about this program. And yes, thank you, Lena. Well, I think now we're ready to move into Q&A. So if you have a question, we would love to hear from you.
I also just dropped in the chat, Michelle had a great question about how to look for neonics. I responded, there are the 5 major types of neonics that you can look for on the bottle. They don't just say contains neonics. They don't make it easy for us. So look for these 5, and that should help you.
Great question. Yeah, I know the thing about it being in what we use for pets, so in collars and in flea and tick treatments, was really, I don't know why it was shocking to me, but just another in the long list of shocking and concerning things that I've learned recently about neonics.
Well, and yeah, I don't know if folks have seen the articles. I would just look up Seresto Pet Collar USA Today. They did a very good series on the neonic containing collars being linked to something like 1,700 pet deaths. And that's probably an underreported because most people don't report. So the fact that there's that many incidents of pets dying from the use of these neonic treated collars is, again, it's a really cause for concern in terms of their impacts on mammals.
Sue also has a great question about how long it takes for a neonic to leave the environment after it is no longer in use.
So I might be able to take that one. The answer is it's kind of complicated because there are 5 different neonic chemicals and it depends where they are. They last for the longest time in soils, and some of the longest lasting ones, unfortunately, are the same ones that they use as seed treatments. So they're buried right in the soil. But some of the neonic chemicals have half-lives of several years, 3 or 4 years. So that's the amount of time it takes for half of it to get out of the environment. So all things considered, if you had an area of heavy neonic use, it could take many years for those neonics to cycle out of the soil, maybe even on the order of a decade or more. But the good news is that neonics are not forever chemicals. They will eventually break down. It's not clear whether all their breakdown products will break down, and actually some of those breakdown products are more toxic. But the idea now, or the thinking now, or the belief is that neonics will break down eventually, but it would take it's going to take many years.
Just giving a little more time if folks have other questions. I know it's a little late, so we just really appreciate you all being here and engaging. Oh, thank you, Leslie. Thank you for being here. We all both saw that. as well, the thank you from Leslie. And just to point it out, we do have in the chat a way that you can find your legislator, and also a Google Doc that you can sign up for to get more information about getting involved locally. Sue said she learned a lot about the extensive use in agriculture and golf courses.
Yeah, and to give you a sense, I mean, so one of the things we didn't mention about neonic coatings on seeds is that actually there's no direct pesticide regulation of the neonics once they're put on the seed. So they're not regulated by just about any state agency in the country, state pesticide agency. The Birds and Bees Protection Act will change that in New York. But we don't have a sense of how big the use is on seeds, but the best estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of the neonic use in the country is on those seeds. And there's pretty extensive use on golf courses too. Again, golf courses, much smaller area compared to the amount of area that we grow corn on. But on those golf courses in those areas, the uses are very concentrated. So we see those hot spots.
Also, Dan, I got a message about diamides. Is that something you might want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, so diamides are what in the jurisdictions that are limiting neonics, eliminating neonics, we see diamides replacing them, not quite at 1-to-1, right? So one thing to note too is, right, where neonics are being prohibited, and this is an important thing in pesticide use, right? Where you limit a pesticide, it's not just about how bad that pesticide is, but when you limit it, what's going to fill the void, right? Or is anything going to fill the void? And I think what's neat about what New York did and what Vermont is doing and what Canada did is they're attacking the uses that really don't need to be replaced with anything, right? Uses that provide no economic benefits to farmers, right? Farmers are losing money using these on seeds. So the best replacement should be nothing. But what we have seen is a lot of that neonic use being replaced with diamide use, not 1-to-1, maybe going from like 100% neonic use in corn to 60 to 70% diamide use in Quebec. But that's still concerning, right? Because we don't want to be using pesticides wastefully. We only want to be using them when we actually need to use them, because pesticides are chemicals designed to kill living things. And some of the same concerns are true for diamides as well, right? They are persistent, they're water soluble, so they get into different parts of the environment. They're much safer to bees, birds, and people, but they're still very toxic to butterflies, right? And other life on planet Earth. So what you've seen in Canada now is that Quebec is going to extend their system to diamides starting in 2025. And I know in other places across the country, like Minnesota, where similar legislation has been introduced, that legislation has focused on systemic insecticides and systemic pesticides, which would include diamides too. Because, right, it's not only neonics that are the problem, but it's the way that neonics work, right? It's the fact that they are persistent in soils and they get everywhere. And there are other pesticides that are being designed that work in similar ways. And again, the diamides, safer for bees, birds, and people, but still, if you don't need to use a pesticide, then you shouldn't use one.
There's another question about any federal action on seed coatings. Talked about this a little bit, how EPA has kind of just dragged their feet, dropped the ball, even though ironically they had this finding. Again, neonics are driving over 200 species towards extinction. There's been very little action on that, but I can let Dan expand a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think, right, don't hold your breath. There was a petition to get EPA to regulate pesticide treated seeds directly. And the agency turned that petition down, and now there's litigation over that. But what I will say is that, EPA's pesticide office historically has been captured by industry, very cozy with industry. And if anybody wants to read more about that, I would recommend Sharon Lerner's piece, The Department of Yes, or you could just type in Monsanto Papers, EPA, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on glyphosate, also known as Roundup. But I think there's a differentiation, right? There are good scientists working in the pesticide office, and they are producing reports about the harmfulness of neonics and other pesticides. But the folks who ultimately make the decision whether to register a pesticide or not, or to limit pesticide use, those folks are a little more political than scientific sometimes. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect. EPA is finding these big impacts, but we're not seeing big action from the agency. And that's been true regardless of the administration that's in charge. So again, don't hold your breath, don't wait for EPA. There is going to be some actions that they're doing on neonics, but it's really up to the states to take action here.
So, question about golf courses, and I would just say very overall, there are very few golf courses that don't use pesticides, but in terms of the specific neonic uses, I couldn't say. Maybe one of you can.
So I don't know for sure, and I don't know in Colorado. I know there's been a trend away from neonics towards diamides in recent years, especially because I think people find the diamides are more effective. And again, they're less toxic to a number of species. But I know at one point neonics were very popular, and it's hard to say.
I also have
And
a
then the
question.
about.
Oh,
sorry.
you go ahead, Joe.
Maybe you're following up on the golf course question? Okay, so question about legislation in Colorado. And PPAN has worked on some pesticide-oriented legislation. We've worked for several years on the pesticide local control issue. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to pass substantial pesticide legislation. I mentioned this in the beginning. We don't anticipate any legislation directly addressing local control or around neonics in 2025. We're going to wait and see how the election shakes out, see what the legislature looks like in 2025. I think there's a lot more education to do, and that's a great reason for you all to be here tonight. We encourage you to stay in touch with us all because we need all of your voices in Colorado if we are going to change the way things are done. So, just really meaningful to have you all here and learning about the issue and talking to your local leaders as well. We really need to have your city and town leaders educated on this issue because they can have quite an impact on our state legislators as well.
We don't have the gobs of money that industry has, but we have people power, and that counts.
And just a follow-up to the local control piece in the legislature this year, we really were it was the closest we ever came. We were about 4 or 5 senators short of getting that bill passed. So I feel like each year we educate more and more folks about these issues, the more the public and our leaders care about it.
I can also add one angle of education that I think is also really important is to farmers. We are seeing that farmers oftentimes don't even know what's treated on their seed, or they don't even have access to untreated seed. And oftentimes they just don't have a choice but to use neonic treated seed. So I think that's a big part of the education component too, is really just trying to empower farmers also to understand what's going on their crops and to hopefully empower them to want to have more agency in those decisions, because I think they absolutely do.
Well, I want to once again thank everyone for being here. I think as Dan and Lena and Joyce have said, your voices and your presence here really does make a difference. And people power is on our side. So I encourage you all to continue to share with friends, to reach out to all of us here, and to get involved locally as much as you can and in ways that make sense for you. And yes, we will be reaching out to you if you sign up and any of the documents that are in the chat. And we really encourage you, especially if you know farmers, please let them know about the new pilot program as well. And I don't know if anyone else would like to say anything before we close, but I just thank you all.
Yeah, just thank you all. Thanks for coming, and ABC, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you all for working with us and continue to be great partners. We really appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Thanks, y'all. See ya.